Tez Zayin Amid Beis. We're down near the bottom of the page, and we started. Well, the top of the Gemara, near the top of the Gemara, we talked about Shmuel's introduction that if someone finds a shtar haknoah, you always return it to the creditor. Shtar haknoah, we know, is an unusual document because it supersedes the actual writing. In other words, if someone lends money to someone else, that's usually a shtar halva. In a shtar haknoah, we say that there was a commitment to repay, even if there wasn't a halva. So that almost takes it out of the getter, out of the zone of a shtar chov, and it's called shtar haknoah. That we discussed last week. Then we started at the bottom, near the two dots, maybe a dozen lines from the bottom. We started this where Rabbi Vora says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan.
I'm sorry, what dot are we? What dot are we? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Tez Zayin Amid Beis.
Thank you.
Tez Zayin Amid Beis. So Rabbi Vora says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, not about a shtar haknoah, but a regular shtar chov. Who do you return it to? So the Gemara wants to show that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold of Shmuel. Shmuel says that in the case of shtar haknoah, we return it to the creditor. Why? To the balcho. Why? Because it's sort of an ironclad document. In the case of a shtar chov, which is not an ironclad document, we don't return it to the creditor. That's the premise of what Abarvo is coming to tell us. So the Gemara says, we'll quickly review, Hamotzi shtar chov b'shuk, if someone finds a shtar chov, a regular loan document in the shuk, afal pi shekasabo handpick. Handpick, remember, was the certification. And what a handpick means is, by definition, that the debtor and the creditor came before Bezdin. And in front of Bezdin, the debtor says, yes, I borrowed and I owe this money. So it's not stamma certification. It all happens in front of Bezdin, and there's witnesses who sign, and the Bezdin gives its imprimatur, its seal, that this happened. So now this is ironclad, because it happened with both the creditor and the debtor there, and the lover said, yes, of course, I borrowed. So this is a very strong document. Says the Gemara, lo yechzru l'balim. You do not return it to the creditor. I mean, why not? So the Gemara says, lo muboy yehechet lo kasav handpick. It stands to reason where there wasn't a handpick, where there wasn't the certification. It's possible to say that this whole document was written as a loan, but the loan never actually happened. That's what our concern always was, that they're writing a document. How do we know it actually was consummated? So if there's no handpick, meaning the debtor didn't admit in front of Bezdin, yes, I borrowed the money, there's always the possibility he didn't borrow. Okay, I get it, without a handpick. Handpick, but if there's a handpick, if there's a certification, just 1 second, Jay, my niu de mekuyim, then what is there to be afraid? What is there to be afraid if there's a handpick? So the Gemara says, lo yachzer de chashinin li peron, because we're afraid of peron. If you remember back on Daf Yud Beis, when we introduced this concept, we said that we have to be afraid of collusion between the creditor and the debtor, that it was really repaid, but the debtor and the creditor got together and they said, we're going to collude. We're going to say it didn't happen. You collect the second time, remember, from that third party, and we'll split the difference. So because of that, kanunya it's called, because of that possibility of collusion, says the Gemara here, that we do not, even with a handpick, because the handpick only says it happened. It doesn't say it wasn't repaid. It says it happened. So, and the lover says, sure, it happened, and you owe me the money, but really he paid. Okay, Jay, go ahead.
I think there were two people who came in a little late. In case they have any refuah shleima or your side, Joe or Dave, anything to add? No? Okay.
Okay. All right. So that's the kasha of the Gemara. The kasha of the Gemara is, In other words, so this is what this shows, that we don't hold like Shmuel. Shmuel is the one who says that in the case of a found document, it goes back to the creditor. That's by a shtar hakno. Comes Ravo and says, not so by shtar chov. We don't hold like Shmuel, because we see that even in a case of henpick, we don't return it to the creditor because we're afraid of collusion. So if we're afraid of collusion, why, according to Shmuel, Shmuel says that a certified document for sure you should be able to collect. So you see, we don't hold, this is the raya, this is what the Gemara wants to come to give a raya, that we don't hold like Shmuel. All right, so far so good. Is Rabbi Vo brings us an example where he disputes Shmuel. Frek the Gemara, Eisve Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Vo. Rabbi Yirmiyah asks to Rabbi Vo, because Rabbi Vo says this in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, so Rabbi Yirmiyah says to him, what are you talking about? Kol Masa Bezdin, Kol Masa Bezdin, hold on, sorry. Eisve Rabbi Yirmiyah, Kol Masa Bezdin Harizer Yachzir. We have a Beferish Mishnah. It's actually our Mishnah, which we're going to learn Mitzvah Shem in a few weeks on Daf Chof. And Daf Chof, the Mishnah says that it's the last Mishnah, I think, in the first parak. So the Mishnah there says, what does the Mishnah say? Let's take a quick look. The Mishnah says, Kol Masa Bezin Harizeh Yachzir. Black and white. Any Masa Bezdin, what's a Masa Bezdin? Any act where the Bezdin gets involved to certify, you return to the creditor. That's a very bold and broad statement. Mishnah says it. So if the Mishnah says that any act of Bezdin you return, how can we say over here, how can Rabbi Vo say that even with a hempick, we don't return it? We do not return it. Why? And by the way, a hempick is a Masa Bezdin. A hempick is exactly what a Masa Bezdin means. You go to court, and in front of court, the debtor and the creditor stand there, and the debtor says, I borrowed 100 zuz, and the two witnesses certify. The court puts its imprimatur. That's the classic Masa Bezdin. Yet the Gemara says a Ravo, Lo yachzir the chashinan lipiron. And Shmuel himself said that we're never afraid of piron. So this is the classic question. So you're going to tell me, okay, you argue on Shmuel, but it's a Mishnah. How can you say what you're saying and you argue on Shmuel? It's a Beferish Mishnah. Kol Masa Bezdin Harizeh Yachzir. And a hempik is a Masa Bezdin. So this is a very powerful question on Rabbi Vo. How could he argue on Shmuel and say that even with a hempik, we're afraid of konunya, we're afraid of collusion? We just said Beferish, a Masa Bezdin takes it out of that realm of concern, and it's acceptable. So that's the kasha that Rabbi Yirmiyah asks on Rabbi Vo. Rabbi Vo was the senior, so Amalei, he says, Yirmiyah Beri. He says, Yirmiyah, my son. He wasn't his son, he gets like an endearment. Lo kol masa bezdin shavin. This is where we came to our conclusion last week. Not every masa bezdin is the same. In other words, it's not black and white. You say Masa Bezdin, you mean Masa Bezdin. No, not every Masa Bezdin is the same. Why? Elakagon shehuchzuk kafran. So we said that where the love turned out to be a liar, a kafran, therefore he doesn't have nemanis. Then when he doesn't have nemanis, then we give it to the creditor. But if he is not a kafran, we don't give it to the creditor. So Rabbi Vo now wants to slice and cut Shmuel's statement, and that which when he says, we're not afraid of Peron. You're not when we're not afraid of Peron. We're not afraid of Peron in a case where the lover was a kafran, but where the lover is not a kafran, we are afraid of Peron. So Rashi says, Kol Masa Bezdin, V'hai Nami Masa Bezdin. There's a Masa Bezdin. So he says, Yirmir Bari Garsinan. Shehuchsik lo vezer kafran. This borrower was declared to be a liar. Pam acheres, another time, not now, a different time. And therefore he has this mantle of kafran. Lefikach einema loma parati. He's not believed to say, I repaid. Ubahu tanan yachzir. And in that case, the Mishnah, our Mishnah, which we're going to learn, that's when the Mishnah says you return it. When he's a kafran. So this is what he means. Not all Masa Bezdin are the same. When you come before Bezdin and you're a regular guy, normal, everything normal, we don't return it because we're afraid of collusion. But when he's a kafran, then we can comfortably say we go back to the malveh, to the creditor, because he's a kafrin and we don't believe him. That's Rabbi Vo's teretz. Okay, Frek the Gemara, Amar Ravo, Mishum Dehuchach, Kafrin, Chada, Zimna, Sulo, Para, Klal, you're going to tell me one stumble and he's forever a kafrin? What about second chances? We believe in second chances. We believe in tshuva. A person who's a kafrin is forever labeled a kafrin and he can never be believed. That strains the limits of our understanding. I mean, there has to be a way that a person can undo what he did. Okay, he made a mistake. He lied one time. Does that mean he's a liar forever? That's what I was cautioned. I mean, when you think of it in the context of our lives, Rav is asking a powerful question. He says, one stumble and you're forever labeled a kafir. You can no longer return to the sort of the norms of commerce. I guess you see that, what do they say? It takes a lifetime to build up a person's credit, a person's good name. It takes just one act to completely knock it down. That shows you the power. But here, this kasha that's exactly a Rabba's kasha. There's nothing he can do to resurrect his name. So Rabba doesn't agree with this. Rabba says, of course, a person can do tshuva, and a person can resurrect his name. And if a person resurrects his name, then we can come back and we can argue that Rabbi Vortaka doesn't hold like Shmuel. Shmuel says that we're never afraid of Peron, and comes Rabbi Vo and says we are afraid of Peron. What about our situation? What are we talking about here in the Mishnah? So then we go back to what we said last week, that when in the back and forth, Rav Zera said that our Mishnah is speaking not about a document of Piron where you repay, that the Mishnah was speaking about a different type of document. Remember, Chaltos of Adrachta they're also Masa Bezdin. These are documents from Bezdin, so they're ironclad, but they are not documents for payment, but documents that are issued for the ability to go collect. Remember, what we said is that you go before court, and the court issues Reuven lent Shimon. Reuven wants to collect. You go before court, and they give Reuven a document. You go find a property that Shimon owns. I don't care where it is. When you get it, you slap it on the holder of the property, and you say, "Here's a document for Bezdin that says Bezdin says I'm allowed to collect." So it's not a collection document. That once you find it, you have to go back to Bezdin. But it's a document that allows you to attach. So he says that's what our Mishnah is talking about. So there's no piron. We're not worried about payment, the actual payment. Payment is a different story, but the ability to attach, that's what our Mishnah is talking about. So he wants to make it clear that we're not talking about what Shmuel's talking about, which is Piron. We're talking about a different case. So what are we left with? We left with that Rabbi Vo says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, he argues on Shmuel. Shmuel says by Ishtar Akna, you can always collect. You can always collect. We're not worried because it's a Ishtar Akna. By a Shtar Chov, we do have concerns, whether it's Kanunya or even with a handpick, it's Kanunya. So therefore, we don't. So it's a Machlokes in Shmuel, and you can't bring a raya from our Mishnah when our Mishnah says that every act of Bezdin you can collect because of this issue of whether a person is a liar or not. So there is a Machlokes, and Rava wants to come and say that no, you can't whitewash him forever and say that he's a liar and therefore he can't. You can't trust him. You can trust him, and if you can trust him, then if a person says I paid, then we don't return it to the creditor because it's not ironclad that it was repaid, especially when the lover argues it. So that's how we sort of end our machlokes, our sugi here, And now the Gemara is going to pick up from here and take a different turn. But that's the thing. So let's look at Rashi. So this is an interesting Rashi, which we touched on last week. V'sulo para klal bitmia, question mark. So the Gemara says, you mean you can never, ever believe him? So if you're afraid of Piron, then what about the fact that the person didn't guard the document? So what does that mean? So we said the last Tosfos, the bottom Tosfos on Tez Zayin and Beis says, even though the Gemara says later on that a person was a huchzik kafran la'osam mamon, and therefore it should be returned to the creditor, hacha de nafel shani, in a case where the document was found in the street, it's different. Why? The muchacha milsa the mishum hachi lahayo nizel l'shamro l'fishapara halove. What we said last week is that there is another mitigating factor, and Rashi hints to it, but Tosfos says it clearly. Rashi hints it in that last Rashi, that in the case of a found document, you can make the argument that a creditor would never have been so slipshod as to lose a document of such importance. It's proof that he was paid, and therefore he didn't care. So if the document got lost, it got lost, but he was paid. So in other words, the psyche of an individual is, if he's got an IOU that he's owed, he carefully puts it away, and he may put it away, he can't find it in his house, but he doesn't just let it fall out of his portfolio or document into the public square. We're talking about someone who picks up a document from the street, literally from the street. So the Gemara says that the fact that it was found in the street is a proof that it doesn't belong to the creditor, because he would not be so sloppy as to allow a document like that to fall. Therefore, we're inclined to say it was paid, and we give it to the lover, we don't give it to the malva, to the creditor. So that's what Rashi is saying over here in this last point, is that the way people act, people don't, you have a $100 bill in your pocket, you're very careful with it. You don't just crumple it up, put it in your pocket, take out your keys, the $100 bill falls out. You put it in your billfold, you hide it, whatever. Okay, so that's the machlokes now between Shmuel and between Rabbi Yochanan and those who hold like him, is whether or not you can automatically, so by shtarak no, you can say that it's Peron, but by nana shtarak no, he argues and says no, that you don't automatically give it to the creditor. Okay, now normally when we learn a Gemara and the sugya sort of ends, the Gemara will oftentimes say, oh, by the way, since we're talking about this, we'll talk about this as well. Nothing to do with the sugya. But the Gemara, the segue is never pronounced in so many words. It's not pronounced in so many words. Take a look at this Gemara. This Gemara is unusual because this segue is spelled out. And you don't see that in the Gemara. That's why I'm pointing it out. So the Gemara says, B'kafran, and since we're talking about liars, Holv also lidan nebebe milza. So the Gemara says, since we're talking about kafran, let me tell you about kafran. In other words, the Gemara this is a segue, but the segues in the Gemara never are spelled out so clearly. So I thought it's an interesting Gemara because normally we just move on. The sugya continues and you realize it's a segue. Here the Gemara says in so many words, oh, by the way, since we're talking about kafran, let me tell you a story about kafran. That's unusual, okay? That's unusual. So, but nevertheless, what's the story about a kafran? So, Amar Rabbi Yosef bar Minyume, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yosef says in the name of Rabbi Yumi, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Amru lo, if he was before Bezdin, and there was a question of whether or not he had to repay a loan. Say Tain Lo, the Bezdin says go and give it to him. Rashi say Tain Lo, the last Rashi on the bottom. Shepaskalo dina bebezdin. The Bezdin gave a psak. Shetzivya lov lesislo, that he has to repay. It's a psak Bezdin. Okay, clearly psak Bezdin. Then says the Gemara on Yud Zayin and Aleph, v'oma parati, and the Love says, but I paid already. You're right, I paid. Nemon, he's believed. So Rashi says, v'oma l'achas man. Let's say a month passed, and the creditor comes back and says to the Love, where's my money? And they go in front of court, Bezdin, and the Love says in front of Bezdin, I paid, parati. I'll pay Bezdin. Bezdin told me to pay, and I was good. I paid. Nemon, says Rashi, b'shvuas Hesses. Now, remember what a shvuas Hesses is. Shvuas Hesses is a shvua d'Rabbanan. When we say a shvua, normally we mean a shvua d'Oraisa. Now, what's pshat a shvua d'Oraisa? So you have to understand that underlying all of this, and we did discuss this in the past, talking about shvuas, a shvua using God's name in the shvua is a very powerful thing. And when a person is required or by Bezdin to make a shvua, then most people will think twice before. We just read the Aseres HaDibros a couple of weeks ago. What does lashav mean? It means taking God's name in vain, making a shvua, using God's name. That's one of the Aseres HaDibros. No small matter. It's equally as powerful as lo tzirtzach. You shouldn't kill, or you shouldn't be a blasphemer, or you should keep the Shabbos. So we're talking about something that is on that level. Okay, so maybe today, I'll swear, no big deal. And remember that a Yid is not supposed to swear. So, in whether it's because of Jews or others, in our court system, do you swear or affirm? In other words, we have introduced a terminology that doesn't require someone to swear because we've recognized that some people, to them, an oath is something they don't cross the line. They don't swear. Even if it's emes, even if it's an emes. In other words, that's how strong it is, not using the Ribono Shel Olam's name, is you don't introduce God's name in anything that is mundane. So if I'm going to go ahead and swear, use God's name, I won't do it. So we affirm. Okay, so that's the backdrop. Now you have to understand how powerful the shvua is. Okay, so now, v'oma parati, if a man says it and he uses a shvua and it says, I paid, nemon, he's believed. But, says Chazal, wait a minute. You're not, okay, he's nemon, and we don't make him make a shvua d'oraisa using d'oraisa, but a shvuas hesses, a rabbinic shvua, we do make him. In other words, we want to give him something to think about. Pause. Okay, so you can't do it in impunity. Okay, I'm not going to make a shvua d'oraisa, but a shvua d'Rabbanan is pretty powerful too. It's called a shvuas hesses. So we say you have to make a shvuas hesses. Okay, fine. It's all good. Now, bo malva lichtov. If in this situation where he says parati and he's believed, the malva then comes to Bezdin and says, Bezdin, I'd like a document from you showing that I can collect this money. In other words, that I want an IOU from the Bezdin saying that he owes me the money. Ein koisvim and oselo, says the Gemara. We do not give him such a document. Says Rashi, bo malva lefonenu lichtov lo adrachta olov. So now he comes before Bezdin and says, Bezdin, give me an adrachta so I can go after him when I find his property. Ein koisvim and oselo, says Rashi, that the Gemara means we don't give him an adrachta that he can collect because we believe the Lova when he said parati, right? And when is this? When the Bezdin says su telo, pay him. Now, what's the next example? Bezdin doesn't say pay him. Bezdin says chayiv ato liten lo. Notice the language. Bezdin says you are mechuyev to give it to him. Right? Slightly nuanced. It doesn't say as a directive, pay him. It says, chayiv atoliten lo. You are chayiv. You are chayiv to pay him. Omo parati. And he says after a month, when the malva comes, Parati, I paid you. Ein eneman. He's not believed to say he paid, and therefore bo malva lichtov kosvin v'nosano. And if the malva comes and wants an adrachta, then they give it to him. Says Rashi, ein eneman. Third line. Why is he not believed? Lishova ela shemagia ela shekenegdo nishba v'notel. So the malva can swear and take it. The kibbutz also hudstruch letova ledin, ein darka lemaher lefroa at sheyifzeku dino psak gomor. So now this is what the Gemara means, and it's a very interesting concept. The words chayiv atolitin lo isn't finality, says the Gemara. When Bez says you're chayiv, it means right now at this point you are chayiv, but we're still deliberating. We're still deliberating whether ultimately you need to pay. So let's look at the Rashi again. Ein eneman lishava ela shekenegdo nishba, the malve can swear v'notel. Why? The tchiloso hutzbach letovo ledin, since in the beginning he has to bring it to Bezdin, meaning the love, and darka lemaher lifroa. Even if the Bezdin says, right now we believe you are chayiv, you have to pay, it's not his way to hurry up and pay. Dino psak gomor. In other words, a person, the nature of a person is not to pay when the Bezdin starts its deliberation, and then if he ultimately winds up winning, then the other guy has to pay him back. That's not the way it works, right? And we know that from our own experience. If we're in a discussion, if Bezdin is deliberating and Bezdin says, it looks like you're chayiv, do you then immediately go to the malva and say, here's your $100? Or do we say, wait a minute, let's get to the conclusion. And when we get to the conclusion, then we'll know whether or not I need to pay it or not. Says the Gemara that if the language of Bezdin is chayiv ataliton, and he says parati ein anemon, he's not believed because in all likelihood, since it's not a final edict, he didn't pay. Therefore, we give him an adrachta. That's the Gemara. Okay, we're going to get to the question of Kafran in a minute. Yeah, but okay.
So Rabbi Grauman, just a nafkamina between this is tzei tein, you go give it to him. It doesn't really, it's sort of in passing. Versus it's chayav, you have to give it. We don't believe that when he says chayav because we're not ready for that yet.
Right. So tzei tein lo is a edict by Bezdin. Okay. Give it to him.
Give it to him.
In other words, we're at the end of the decision. Give it to him. And so we believe that a person will honor Bezdin's decision. But when it says chayiv, you are chayiv, we derive chayiv to mean at this point you're chayiv, but we still have to finish the deliberation. So Rashi explains, when you're chayiv and you're at the beginning of the deliberation, who goes and pays? Nobody goes and pays right away.
That's too early.
I mean, he wants to do the right thing, but Bezdin hasn't given him a final decision. Yeah, Joe, go ahead.
Talking about language, in the previous lines you just completed, it says that the court would to write and to give the document to him. Why do you need to say both sets of words? If you don't write it, there's nothing to give. So why is the language that way?
You're asking why it says ein kosvin v'nosen lo.
Correct. If you don't write it, there's nothing to give.
Right. Okay, I understand you're parsing the words, but what happens? So in other words, in this situation, what is an adrachta? An adrachta is a document that Bezdin drafts, and in it says and gives it to the malve, and says to the malve, here it is. It's your how do we describe this? It's your take this document and go find property that's owned that the lover owns somewhere.
In English, they call it a certificate of foreclosure and a seizure warrant.
Okay.
Seizure.
Yeah, that's the right. Okay, that's the right word. It's a seizure. In other words, it's a document of seizure that you can go ahead and seize property. You can't collect it. You can seize it. So I think what the Gemara is saying here is why it says kosvin v'nosen is because first the Bezdin has to write it. In other words, it's a document created and then venosin. So I guess the Gemara wants to, he comes and says, can you please give me a seizure document? So the parlance of the Gemara is kosvim venosin, that you write it and you give it. No, I understand you can't give it if you don't write it, but the other way around is what happens if the Gemara, if it would say just kosvin and not nosnin, then you might ask the question, okay, so the Bezdin is writing it, but so what? So they're writing a shtar chaltah. What good does that do? So I think it's kind of like one word, kosvin menosvin, to indicate that the Bezdin creates it and gives it to him that allows him to seize it. I think that's what the Gemara means when it says kosvin menosvin, that you can't just write, you got to write and give. Sure, you
That's
can't
what I'm
give
saying. But if the Bezdin never writes it, there's never anything to give.
That's correct. That's correct. So you're right. So you want to impute and say skip kosvin, just say nosvin, right? You're right. That's what you're saying. You're saying skip the kosvin and just give the nosvin. So I guess the Gemara wants to be absolutely clear that this is a document that has to be originally written, that you write it for him, and then you give it to him. I mean, again, the Gemara doesn't really, Rashi doesn't say anything on it either. But kosvin is kind of like it's two words into one. You write it and you give it.
Rabbi, maybe along those lines. I'm sorry to interrupt. When the Beis Din gets involved and does a ruling, they say Tainlo, which is a final ruling. Is that documented? Does the Beis Din write down their rulings? I mean, is there a scribe? Is there a reporter that's writing down the Beis Din's rulings?
Yes.
So what I'm confused on is it's one thing where the debtor says I paid you, the lender says no you didn't, so they go to Beis Din and they figure out what's going on. But once Beis Din is involved and they write down the fact that says say Tainlo, the debtor owes the money to the lender, and then the debtor comes later on and says, I paid him, we believe him. Once Beis Din is involved, doesn't it have to be documented? In other words, wouldn't we say to the debtor, prove to us you paid him, or the lender, prove you haven't paid?
No. See, it's not like our system. In other words, if you go to court and you get a judgment, right? You get a written judgment.
Right.
You take that judgment, you want to go collect. But now the Bezdin is no longer involved, right? The Bezdin finished its deliberation. It gave you a judgment. Go out and you want to collect that judgment. Now, you're entitled to it because you have the document. Does that mean that you got it? No, you have to pick yourself up, go collect the money. Now you run into the problem, he doesn't have the money is tied up. You got your judgment, you're allowed to collect, but we have something Yale called judgment proof. What does judgment proof mean? Give me all the documents in the world, I don't have a nickel to give you. So you have your judgment, you have all the writings from the Bezdin, but you can't collect. So now this Malveh comes back to Bezdin and says, you gave me a judgment. I went to collect. And the Loba says, but I paid you. I paid you on this judgment. Now there, we're not so about getting the right paperwork. Okay, so maybe this is outside of court. So he says, so the Gemara says Nemon, that a person is Nemon when the Bezdin says to pay, and we're not going to say that he stiffed Bezdin. Okay? Now, what happens if the court says Chayiv, which in our parlance means we're deliberating, but it looks like you're Chayiv? Then we say it's not the likelihood that he paid, because a person said, look, you get an invoice. Do you pay your invoice the day you get it? No, usually take a day, a few days, a week, whatever. A week goes by, 10 days goes by, and you don't get it. So the guy comes and says, where's my money? So, I have an invoice. I paid you. Okay, here you have something better than invoice. You have the Bezdin telling Chayiv.
Court document.
Chayiv doesn't mean finality, Chayiv. It means you're Chayiv. So a person says to himself, I'm Chayiv. Okay, I get it. But wait, but I still have the possibility of being Potter. So until I am told Tainlo, I'm still on the fence, I want to hold myself to be potter. Therefore, when a person says he didn't pay me, he's not Neman. Why would he be Neman? A person doesn't rush to pay, right? There's a reason the mitzvahs doesn't include paying when he's not supposed to pay. That's what the Gemara is really telling us at this point. Okay, so the Gemara gives us a chiluk between an edict of Bezdin and let's call it a strong suggestion from Bezdin that you're chayiv. Comes Rav Zera, Rav Zvid, Rav Zvid Mishmei Rav Nachman Omar. No, I don't like this distinction. 4 lines from the top. I don't like this distinction of Sutein Lo or Chayiv V'Omar, and he says as follows: Bein Sutein Lo, Bein Chayiv Matzalitano V'Omar Parati Neman. Oh no. When a Bezdin says Tein Lo or Chayiv, I hold that to be the same thing. There's no such thing that the Bezdin makes a suggestion. If the Bezdin says Chayiv Atalitalo, it means you Chayiv. You're Chayiv. He doesn't hold from the distinction. Bo Malve Lichtov and Kosvin Venosimlo. We don't give it to him because we assume that he paid. Why? Because a person reacts to Bezdin the same whether it's Tzutenlo or whether it's Chayiv. This is Rav Zvid saying. So what's the machlokes? Why does the Gemara give us 2 different lashonos? Why is the Gemara telling us that if they were one and the same? Ella, if you want to make a distinction, hachihu de'ika lefluge. This is the distinction between Sutein Lo and Chayiv Lo. In other words, the circumstance of Sutein Lo and Chayiv Lo are different. How are they different? Omru Lo Sutein Lo. If he said go, the language says Sutein Lo. V'Oma Parati. So now we're going one step further. And he says, I paid. And Adim said, we were there when Reuven came to Shimon and said, pay me. Reuven was the Malva. Shimon was the Loven. Reuven had a edict from Bezdin Sutein Lo. He went to collect to Shimon, and Shimon says, Parati. And Shimon, Shalo Paru. And as he was there, and the Adim said he didn't pay. It's one thing when you and I casually, I have a judgment from Bezdin, I come to you, and I say, I want to collect, and you say, I paid you. Don't you remember? Last Tuesday, we were standing under the awning, it was raining, and I gave you $100. I said, what are you talking about? Then he's Naman. But if he goes in front of Adim, and Adim were there when Reuben says to Shimon, I just got a judgment for Bezdin, pay me. And he says, I paid you. And the Adim says, he didn't pay. He asked them and he didn't pay. How could you now believe him said, I paid, we were there. Then v'chozav Parati. Then Shimon comes back and says, I was caught red-handed. The witnesses saw and said I didn't pay. So I'm now going to say, yes, but subsequent to that, Parati, this is now the example the Gemara wants to tell us about Huchzik Kafran. So if a person denies paying and Bezdin says he's a liar, so you have black and white, you have him lying, then he's Huchzik Kafran and he's not believed. Right? Different circumstance. Because now it's not just Malva and Love, it's Malva, Love, and Adim. Adim testified that he did not pay, and then he's caught red-handed because he said he paid. So he decides to come back to the Bezdin and says, you know what? Okay, I didn't pay, but afterwards I paid. Says the Gemara, now, that's if it's Sutein Lo. However, Chayiv Osam Litan Lo. If Bezdin says you're Chayiv v'Oma Parati, and a person says, I paid, he's not considered a Huchzik Kafran.
Why would we believe when he lied right away when he said I did pay when it wasn't true? Why would you believe him when he says the second round.
That he paid. So here Rav Zvid wants to make a chilik between an edict of Bezdin, where Bezdin says, give it to him, and where Bezdin says, chayiv. Why? So now he says, my tama, why do you believe him? Ishtamutehu kol mishtamid. So exactly what we said earlier. So let's look at Rashi. Let's look at Rashi. Loma parati l'achazman v'ha'edim me'idim osa shelo para. B'fanenu tova lifrolo. The Edom say, in front of us, Reuven wanted to collect from Shimon, al pi bezdin, below para. And he didn't pay. The Edom say he didn't pay. Ubefneim ho is lava al pi bezdin. So in front of the Edom, he had the chutzpah to say, in front of Bezdin, he had the Edom, he had the chutzpah to say, I paid. So now, if he lied in front of Edom, then we don't believe him unless he comes back with Edom and has to pay. So it's considered huchze kafir la'osu moment she'ein neman od alav lomar hizarti parati at sheyifra be'edom. That's when he lied in front of the Edom, where the Bezdin says tutein lo. But where the Bezdin says chayiv, lo huchze kavrin, he's not considered a kafir. To your point, Jay, the nishba, and he can swear a shuas hesed shaparu, ba'afa pi shelo paru miyad kishetova b'fnei Edom. Even though he lied in front of the Edom, the ein zeh meyes Bezdin, this is not considered a chutzpah of someone who lies to Bezdin. Why? The given the lo pasku though, psak gamor, says Bezdin didn't give him a final psak, nishbat mimenu, sover that he'll wait. So in other words, Rav Zvid is saying that simply the case of Sutein lo and Chayiv lo does not make a difference. The real difference happens when you lie in front of witnesses, but not in Bezdin. So in other words, what the Gemara is telling us, what this Machlokas is telling us, it's one thing to lie to witnesses outside of Bezdin. It's another thing to have the chutzpah to come into Bezdin and to lie.
But we had two different situations at Bezdin. If they make a recommendations, it implies that they're not finished.
Right.
And they say, so the two options at the Bezdin level, why do they show up at the witnesses, whether they make a difference or not? It seems like if he's lying, he's lying. It wouldn't matter if he's lying in front of Edom. It doesn't matter it shouldn't matter whether the Bezdin says I'm in the middle or I'm at the end. He's already lied.
No, that's a good question. So in other words, Rav Zvid is the one who says that in a case, he doesn't want to make a normal distinction between Tutein lo and Chayiv lo. He said they all mean the same thing.
Right.
So it's not what the Bezdin said. The Bezdin said it.
Right.
It's did you lie in front of witnesses?
His behavior is what.
His behavior. So
right.
So Rav Zvid says his behavior in front of witnesses, that's where the language of the Bezdin becomes important. In other words, a person in his mind would never lie to the Bezdin if the Bezdin says, go pay. So therefore, when he says it in front of witnesses, I didn't pay, he's no longer ever believed. But if the Bezdin said chayiv lo, which means go pay, correct. Rav Zvid says it means go pay. But you then went in front of witnesses and said, I paid, then in front of witnesses, he can stall. Rav Zvid is adding this one little knech, this one little wrinkle, that in front of Bezdin, he wouldn't have the chutzpah, but in front of witnesses, he will stall. And he will say, you know what? I don't mean to not pay, but I don't want to pay prematurely. So in front of witnesses, he's inclined to say, I paid. So therefore, we don't punish him as harshly if he comes back later and says, you're right, I didn't pay. We don't attribute it to him being a liar. We're saying he just stalled. So, you know, it's a fine line, Jay, between stalling and between lying. So, you know, as kids, I don't know if you remember, maybe some of us did it, some of us didn't do it. You know, when you were confronted and you were caught, you justified in your mind, nah, I'm not really saying it because I can justify not saying it. So you make all kind of cheshbonis. As kids, I remember we used to do that. If someone said to you and you called you bold face that you did something wrong, but you made some kind of a dreidel. It's not what you think it is. It's not what you think it is, right? We, in our own simple minds, we do that. And we know if you're an adult, you realize what you're saying is nonsense. But as a kid, so the Gemara is telling us in human nature, a person can deceive himself to saying something that he believes to be true. So a person who, with a bezdin says chayiv, I don't have the chutzpah in bezdin to lie, but if a witness says, but I was there and you didn't pay, okay, there I can take license and say, yeah, but I meant I'm just stalling. I didn't really mean I didn't pay. You know, I'm not denying it 100%. It's just that right now I don't have to pay. In other words, the justification is right at this moment I don't have to pay because the magic words were sutein lo, not chayiv. So Rav Zvid is really parsing his words and saying that chayiv and sutein lo are the same in bezdin, but not in front of witnesses. In front of witnesses, one is a little bit more watered down than the other. I mean, clearly it takes a little bit of a jump to make that conclusion, but Rav Zvid says, I conclude that way. I conclude that in front of witnesses, and Rashi even says it, Lo huchze kapron, v'nishba sheparu, he swears with the Shuvas Hesses, v'afal pi shelo paru miyad, this is not a chutzpah. May is being brazen. This is not a chutzpah on bezdin. Even though chayav lo is a pretty powerful thing for the bezdin to say, but he's justifying it that it isn't a final. It's only a final. It's only part way, but not all the way. So I grant you, this isn't the most powerful argument one can make. But Rav Zvid wants to sort of parse those words. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
If you're going to talk about this being a chutzpah on Beis Din, then why, and you're making this distinction for the debtor, why aren't you making this similar type of distinction for the creditor and saying to them, you brought something to me and you're swearing on it that there was a bill to be paid when in actuality there wasn't. So why isn't there a detriment on the creditor also? For the opposite side of this.
Yeah, but how are you saying that he's not entitled to the money? What gives you?
No. I'm saying the bet. He's going.
In other words, if a person, this is the general rule. Hamotzi mechavera olav. In other words, the Gemara even in the past has given us reason to believe that a person doesn't, out of a figment of his imagination, come to his friend and say, "You owe me money." People don't do that. I don't go to you and say, you know what, you owe me $100. I woke up this morning and you owe me $100. And as a person is believed, at least ab initio, initially, a person is believed when he goes to his friend or to someone and says, you owe me money. It's not something he woke up with as in a dream. So we start out by saying, oh, but you got to bring proof. We're not going to accept your words just because you said it. So bring us some sort of proof. So he goes to, and he brings proof. Let's say he meets the threshold level of showing that he's owed the money. Fine. The borrower says, oh, you brought level of proof? I paid you. What do you mean I paid you? Of course I paid you. So now the whole kasha is, who do we believe? The creditor or the debtor? Okay, so now we're going back and forth.
So it comes back to an issue of timing as to when the creditor makes the complaint to Beis Din versus when the debtor actually goes ahead and makes his response back to Beis Din. So that's the issue of timing that we're talking about.
Well, so we're talking about, So we're talking about where the creditor goes to Beis Din and says, and Beis Din says, you're right. You have good proof that you owe the money, and we're going to give you a judgment. Here's your judgment. Fine. I have a judgment. Now, Now he wants to collect on the judgment. A month later, he comes back to Bezdin and says, I'm still trying to collect on this judgment. And he hauls the Lova into court. And Lova says, what are you talking about? I paid you. So then we go to this whole Gemara that we said in this last week. So where's your document? Oh, I don't have my receipt. I don't have my receipt. So we say Naman, that if he makes a Shavuos Hesed, a rabbinic vow, he's believed to say he paid. So this all happens in the context of Bezdin giving him an order, and outside of Bezdin, he does his payment. So and so that now we make a chilik between what the Bezdin says. Rav Zid says no chilik. In either case, the Bezdin says what it says. What's the chilik? The chilik is, the difference is, if he got his judgment, and then Reuven comes to collect the judgment, and he has his two friends, Yisachar and Zavulun, and he goes to Shimon and says, Shimon, I want you to pay me. And in front of Yisachar and Zavulun, he said, I paid you. Really? I have two witnesses here that says you didn't pay me. Okay, in other words, I've not seen you since the judgment, and they say you didn't pay. So then Reuven says to himself, oh boy, I stepped in it. Let me go back to Bezdin and admit, I didn't pay. You're right, I didn't pay. So now Rav Zvid says, if he was given an edict to pay and he lied in front of witnesses, now it shows him to be brazen in front of the court, and we will not believe him. He's a kafran. He now has this label of liar. Says Rav Zvid, but if the Bezdin didn't use the magic words, su tainlo, they use the words chayiv, which also means you should pay, and then and then the whole incident happened with the witnesses. That Rashi says, explains us the Gemara, that's not being brazen in front of the court, because in front of the witnesses, he would stall. So let's just say there were no witnesses. And Reuven came to Shimon and said, pay me. And he says, wait a minute, I paid you. According to Rav Zvid, without the witnesses, right, he'd be believed. And therefore, he would be considered a liar if somehow later on it showed him to be untrue. But since the collection aspect of this was done outside of Bezdin, so he says to himself, this is what the Lova is thinking. I'm not in front of Bezdin here. I would never have the chutzpah to say to Bezdin, I paid. I would never do that. But since I know that in 30 days, the Bezdin is going to give me a final judgment, I don't want to pay right now. So I tell a white lie, and I said, I paid. And the witnesses say, you told us that you paid, and we know you didn't pay. Says Rav Zvid, in that circumstance, it's not the same as telling Bezdin and lying, because he's really fending for time. So we understand that if he tells witnesses, I paid, and he's found to be untrue, he didn't mean to lie to Bezdin, he just wanted to buy time. That's Rav Zvid's interpretation of our Gemara. So Rav Zvid is saying that chayiv in and of itself is strong if it's in front of Bezdin, but chayiv is not as strong if it's only in front of witnesses. That's the distinction Rav Zvid is making over the initial Gemara, where in the beginning we said that he's a kafran only if sutain lo, but not in chayiv lo. Rav Zvid says no, he's a kafran even with chayiv. When is he a kafran? If he lies to Bezdin. But if he doesn't lie to Bezdin, only two witnesses, not quite the same. So that's his interpretation of it. So it's not a license to lie, but we have seen in previous Gemaras where a person might fudge the truth in order to buy time or to reach a conclusion. So human nature being what it is, we don't say he's a ganef. We don't say he's a kafrin. We don't label him with this strong label of a liar. We say, you know what? He just inferred from this. He inferred from this that he had some time. Clearly, when the final judgment comes, he's going to abide by the judgment. No question about it, says Rav Zvid. But in the interim, we can give him some grace period. That's what the Gemara, that's what he says over here. So therefore, says Rav Zvid, so let's just finish this. Sovar, he holds Adamina Barabana and Bedina until the Rabbanim will tell us Bedin, until the rabbis will come back and tell me 100% that I'm chayiv. That will be enough.
Rabbi,
now,
excuse me. We're assuming here that there was a due date on this loan. That's why this whole thing happened. Otherwise, if he says if he would have said you pay me back whenever you can.
Right. 100%.
Had a date, June 1st that has to be paid.
Correct. That's why he came to Bezdin. Exactly right, because he has a document that has a strike date. The date has come. The guy doesn't pay him. He goes to court and says, it's like any case you go before court. You can't go to court prematurely and say he owes me $100. I want my $100. You have to have a reason to go to court to say now my time is to collect.
But if the Bezdin knows it had a due date, why wouldn't they come down with the final decree, pay him? Because otherwise they know he's going to stall for time and he can stall for 6 months.
So Jay, maybe you haven't been in court enough times, because in court, black is not black and white is not white. You go to court, I have a due date, here I would collect. He says, oh, but there was mitigating circumstances and this. And the court says, yeah, I have to take that under advisement. I have to review whether or not there were mitigating circumstances, whether June 1 maybe there was an extension, maybe there was an inherent extension. In other words, the court is now, we got to think about it. It's not that it was as black as white as you want to make it think. You're right, Jay. If I have a document that says June 1, you got to pay me, and I come and I say it's June 1, then the court should say su tenlo. But if for some reason June 1 wasn't quite June 1, or June 1 had some loose end to it, then the court will say chayiv ata, you're chayiv. But wait a minute. You say there's mitigating circumstances. We have to come back a second time to court and we have to look at it. So the guy says, oh, there's mitigating circumstances. I'm not paying him right now. In other words, there's all kinds of sort of
but he wouldn't have said that I paid him if he's trying to stall. But he did say to the agent.
No. So then later on, says Rav Zvid, if he came and he said, I paid you. Now, in other words, this is already outside of court. So we had that circumstances, and he said, I paid you, then he's not believed.
So he's telling one story to the Bezdin.
Right, and another story to the Edom. Right.
Another one to the Edom.
Right.
Okay.
So that's what Rav is saying, is that the story to the Edom isn't as airtight as the story to Bezdin. And to the Edom, he doesn't necessarily say everything he should, but he would never lie to Bezdin. In front of Bezdin, he would never lie.
He could have told the Edom, I went to Bezdin already in Iraq circumstances.
Yeah, but he doesn't. Yeah, he doesn't want to go. He doesn't want to go that route. All right. So let's just go a little bit further. Omar Rabbi Baruchana and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Baruchana says, Rabbi Yochanan, I'll give you. In other words, he gives an example of this. That this is actually the case. Monali biyadcha, that the malva comes and says, you owe me $100. Monali biyadcha, you have $100 of mine. I don't have any money of yours. I paid you. And the Edom testify that he did lend him because of Omer Parati. In other words, the Edom say, oh, wait a minute. We know that he did lend you $100. Don't deny that he lent you. We were there when he lent you the money. And then because of Omer Parati, and then he realizes he was caught. So he says, Parati, I paid. He's considered a kafrin to that money. He's considered a kafran. Okay, as a clear example. What's the now? There was a concrete example. Kihod the Shapse Berei de Rab Marinis. This fellow by the name of Shapsi, who was the son of Rab Marinis, Kosav lo lakalosa itztala de milsa biksubosa. Today in our ksubas we have what's called standard language. In other words, in a ksuba you have the language of what the groom pledges to the kala, to the bride, in the event of dissolution of the marriage or if he dies. In other words, the ksuba is the dowry, and this is what you have to pay. So Shapsi was the son of Rabbi Marinis. Rabbi Marinis was a wealthy man, and he wrote into the ksuba. In those days, the ksuba wasn't standard printed form, and he pledged a fancy coat to the kala, the kobla aleh, and he in other words, he was the guarantor. So Rav Marinis was the guarantor. Rashi says it's the levush, a garment. So he pledged this nice garment to the kala as part of the ksuba. Okay, fine. Irk's ksubasa, she comes to collect on the ksuba, meaning she's divorced or her husband dies, and now she comes to Bezdin and says, okay, this is my dowry. I'm coming to collect on my ksuba. Rav Marinis says, what do you mean? That's not true. I never pledged to give you a coat. It didn't happen, right? Also, Sadeh, witnesses come. We're in Kosovo law. So the ksuba is now lost. The ksuba is gone. It's lost. She comes to collect on the ksuba in front of Bezdin. And she says, in my ksuba, it says that I was pledged this fine coat, a fur coat, let's say. And Rav Marinis says, fur coat? What are you dreaming? I never pledged to give you a fur coat. Also, Sadeh, the witnesses come, but I'm in. What are you talking about? Kosovo law. We were there. We were the witnesses, and we saw the ksuba, and the ksuba said that he pledged this fine coat. Lasof amalahu parata. So Rav Marinis said, caught red-handed. He says, but I gave you the coat. No, this is the exact example that we have here. She says, the document isn't here. He denies it, gets caught red-handed, comes back and says, I gave you the coat. You're right, I gave you the coat. Also, Lekamed Rabbi Hyatt, he comes before Rabbi Hyatt. Rabbi Hyatt says, so regarding that itztala, he's huchzik kafran because he denied it beferish. In other words, and the witnesses came and said, yes, you did. Huchzik kafran. So he's considered a kafran. So in other words, this is a proof. This is a proof to our Gemara that in the case where you lied to witnesses, that like Rav Zvid says, that you considered a kafran with regard to itztala. Rather. So in this particular case, it's not a proof to Rav Zvid. I'm sorry, it's not a proof to Rav Zvid, because according to Rav Zvid, where he didn't have a direct edict of Bezdin, it was only in front of witnesses, you're allowed to fudge. A person can fudge. But here there's no case like that. Here he came in front of Bezdin, and Bezdin said, and there were witnesses, and the witnesses, the Bezdin didn't say anything. The Bezdin didn't say Sutei lo or Chayev lo. It was just in front of witnesses. And witnesses said that yes, you were Chayev this fur coat. And he says, I have charata, I paid it. He's considered a kafran. So he's considered a kafran just on the words of the witnesses alone. Rav Zvid's saying that on the words of witnesses alone, not Bezdin. No, it's not that terrible, or it's not conclusive. Here we see he brings a beferish example of what happened there in that case, where he came to Bezdin and he lied in front of witnesses, and witnesses says, yes, you did, and it was enough to make him a kafran. So he was considered a kafran regarding that itztala, regarding that thing. So the Gemara wants to conclude there that that it's not necessarily like Rav Zera, but that generally speaking, if you lie in front of witnesses, even without a bezdin circumstance, but if you lie in front of witnesses and witnesses catch you red hand, and then you want to come and retract and say, yes, I paid, then he's considered a liar, and we don't believe him. So that's the conclusion here. This is a proof of that. The Gemara will pick up on that, Mitzvah Shem. It'll go a little bit further than that, but at least right now we have a conclusion to our Gemara that Rav Zera's distinction isn't 100% valid, and if a person is considered a kafron, even with just witnesses is we say kameya edim, right? We say that if 2 witnesses come and testify, it's like 100 witnesses come and testify. I mean, it's ironclad. You lied. You didn't tell the truth. How are you going to wiggle out to say I didn't mean it, this, that, and the other? You either pledged it in the ksuba or you didn't pledge it in the ksuba. You said you didn't. You were caught red-handed, and now we consider you a liar. But, says the Gemara, la'oso itztala. Regarding that itztala, he's considered a liar. Is he a liar with regard to other matters? So let's hold off on that, because the Gemara here concludes that regarding this itztala, he's a liar and he has to pay it, because he lied about the itztala. Says Rashi, who's the kafir la'osa itztala? Ad she yifreh, until he pays. So now he has to bring proof through other witnesses that he gave her the itztala. He's no longer believed, yes, I paid it. So that's the conclusion of that Gemara. Anyway, you see from all these Gemaras that certainly in the time of the Bezdin, you know, the Bezdin gave the Bezdin was very somehow careful that the lashon of the Bezdin has to be very, very carefully stated. If the Bezdin says one thing or the Bezdin says something else, it's not sort of, you know, the same thing. The Bezdin has a reason for what it says. Lahavdil, just to give you a final example, we see this in those, for those of you who are interested and read Supreme Court decisions, you see that the Supreme Court is very makbid, extremely makbid in their decisions, how a decision is made. Why? Because the Supreme Court doesn't want to give a generic decision. It wants to be as specific as possible. So in its lashon, in its language, it will give specific decisions and then not react to another part of the same case that it had in front of it that it could have disposed, but it didn't. Why? Because it's makbid on the lashon. This is the lashon, this is what it says. Now you have the Supreme Court lawyers who specialize and look at the words of the court and say, you know what? You think you won? You didn't win. The court gave you a very narrow victory. Doesn't mean that the next time this circumstance comes up in a slightly different nuance, that it isn't going to start lichatchila. You're going to have to go through the whole parsha again because the court didn't give you a teretz. Lahavdil, this is what's going on here. The Bezdin gives you a teretz, but sometimes in the words of the Bezdin, it's a teretz without a teretz. It's a teretz without really being a teretz. So those who can interpret the lashon of the Bezdin said, you know what? It wasn't really a teretz. The Bezdin didn't really tell you what you think it told you. It was more of a, yeah, you should pay. But if you don't pay, it's not so gefährlich. That's what's going on here. So just to give you an insight that not all lashon is the same. Lashon is very important. Language is very, very important. And it's how you say it that really makes an important difference as to whether or not you can, in this case, collect. But, you know, there are many other nuances. In the cases of ksubis and kedushin and gittin, language is much more precise because there we're dealing with matters. We always say that in dina mominus is not the same as dina nefashis, or dina mominus is not the same as dina halacha. In other words, mominus, if you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. If you make a mistake in the fascist, it is the end of the world. Or you make a mistake in Kachim and Taras, it is the end of the world, because Chas v'Shalom, terrible things can come out of.
Which is why you need more dayanim in those cases.
Say again?
Which is why you need more dayanim.
Well, you need dayanim who are mumchin, who understand, how to.
You also need more of them, right? Like it says, a regular case b'shlosha dinei nefashos. You need like
23, right, exactly right. So in other words, once you get to the higher levels, you need more deliberation, so that you're relying on spread more wisdom. But anyway, it's an insight on the court. So all right, so we'll end here. Mitzvah Shem Yudzayin Amud Aleph. We'll pick up next week on the continue the sugya, but we'll delve further into it.
Shkoyach.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Good day, everybody.
Good week.
Rabbi Grauman?
Yes.
I have a problem with what you were just saying, and here's why. Because if you're talking about what you were talking about, Rabbi Bar Chanina was talking about Rabbi Yochanan, and he said that this is nothing, it's not in my possession anymore. That's an accurate statement if he's already paid it back. So to look at something and say to someone, I had this, I paid it, it's as if it no longer exists to me, is relatively reasonable perspective on this. So to go ahead and say that your money is no longer in my possession because I paid you back is appropriate. So therefore, I don't see how you could go ahead and claim that he's someone who denies that there was a loan or there's an outstanding debt that he needs to pay back.
Well, so the angle of the Gemara here, what the Gemara is focusing on is, according to Zvid, is there's a distinction between saying something in court and saying something out of court. When you are in front of Bezdin, you are kaviyachol in front of God, right? You don't lie. You say, I paid, I didn't pay. That's in front of Bezdin. This is Rav Zvid's interpretation. When you are not in front of Bezdin, you're only in front of witnesses. Here's the distinction. In other words, you would never in front of Bezdin say something that wasn't untrue. You might shade a little bit in front of witnesses because in your mind, you're not lying. In your mind, you're really saying, yeah, but it's not quite what the Bezdin said. If you're in Bezdin, Bezdin will tell you, Chayiv means go pay. Chayiv means go pay. But when you're not in front of Bezdin and you say Chayiv, then you extrapolate that Chayiv means right now I'm Chayiv. So to do the right thing, I should pay. But if later the Bezdin finds me not Chayiv, then the other guy owes me money. That's what should happen. In other words, Chayiv, I should pay you. If after the deliberation, the Bezdin says, you know what, we changed our minds, then you should give me back my money. But the money should have already been given over, that $100 loan. Says the Lover, wait a minute, I don't want to do that. I don't want to pay, and it might only be an interim payment, and now I have to go to him and collect the money. That's a burden on me. Let me hold the money. If the Bezdin really comes back and says, Chayiv, of course I'll pay him. I'm not a gamet. But to say that I should pay him and then wait for the decision and maybe I get the money back, why should I do that? I need the money now. I can use the money now. If I have to pay, I will pay. Trust me, I will pay. I'm not a gamet. So Rav Zvid is saying it has to do with the mindset of the Lovev. In his mind, yeah, I should pay. And if the court said, I'm standing in front of court, the court said Chayiv, and I said I would never lie and say I paid, right? But to the witnesses, it's not in front of court. I'm buying time. So Rav Zvid says that's different. Okay, somehow it's different to say to the witnesses than it is to the court. That's how he sort of mitigates or distinguishes it between the language. In court itself, there is no distinction between Tzutelo and Chayev, all the same. Outside of court, yeah, now there's a distinction. So that's what he's trying to say. It may strain the thinking a little bit. I mean,
no,
really,
I think with your explanation, I think where I'm getting wrapped around the axle is with the timing of these. And when I look at the words like where the debtor is saying that I no longer owe you anything, I'm thinking about it being after the fact, not still during the middle of the deliberations, right, before the bet din comes back and makes its final decision. So yeah, it comes down to an issue of timing. And when are these are saying, and so I've been thinking and looking at this is after the fact and after the Beis Din has done its job and all, and then we're going through this whole process.
Right.
And so
yeah,
those two pieces in timing is what where I'm getting confused.
Right. We never accuse another Jew of being a ganev. We don't want to accuse him of being a ganev. So if there's somehow some justification, however convoluted, that right now I don't owe the money, if I'm conclusively shown to owe the money, I will pay it. So to call him a liar when he's still, the jury's out, as they say, do I really want to call him a liar, a kafran, to make him puzzle from ever being believed? Nah, I don't want to go that far. I don't want to call him a liar and cancel him out when in his mind, he's still on the fence as to whether he owes it. When there will be a definitive judgment that he owns it, he'll go ahead and pay it. That's what the vid is. And again, it's a mental thing to think about this, because many of us would say it's a distinction without a difference. Come on, you owe it, go ahead and pay. So the teretz is, sure, I can go ahead and pay, but if they find me not liable, now you owe me money. Now I got to go chase you. I don't want to go chase you. You may not have the money when I got to go get it. So let me make sure I owe it to you and I'll pay you. But to go chase you and then to say, here, I'll pay you. And then later on, you're going to go comfort with me and say, wait a minute, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to do that. So there is that glimmer of difference. Therefore, he tells a white lie. That's what we call a white lie. But it's still a lie. Okay, it's still a lie. But it's not with the intent to totally deceive. It's to delay. And the Gemara has given us enough examples in the past where someone wants to delay that we can't, that he's really not a bad guy, because delay is not the same as deny. Delay is not the same as deny.
Thank you. I need to run my batteries. It's telling me I got to go plug in.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Rabbi, what were the witnesses doing at the Malava's house when they should have been testifying in court?
Well,
he met them in the street somewhere, and
yeah,
so
exactly.
Human nature is you'll take liberties in the street that you won't take in court.
Exactly right. You'll take liberties in the street or outside that you wouldn't take in court. Right.
And also we see generally that we bend over backwards with punishment, with everything to give a person the benefit of the doubt. And
exactly.
You have to have Adam, Hasra. I mean, the court is a whole different matter than regular.
Right. This is why Rava said in the previous stop, he said, you mean to tell me if a guy lies, he's a liar forever? I mean, it's one thing to say he lied in this case, but is he a liar forever? You want to brand him as a liar forever? Maybe there was some glimmer of justification. So we have to be careful. At some point, it's appropriate to say he's a liar. Yeah, maybe when he has a chazaka as a liar. But to say that one lie should dismiss him from ever being believed, that's what Rava said. No, that's why he said that case wasn't about lying; it was about something else. Because I can't accept that one lie makes him puzzle forever.
Right.
All
right. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? We're good. All right.
Thank you,
everybody.